that they're going to make some concessions. And now our negotiators hear those words and go back to the president and say, look, this thing looks like it may happen. And you heard him say publicly, look, these guys really want a deal. I think that has always been part of their negotiating strategy.
What if the most dangerous part of this crisis is not what has already happened, but the next line that gets crossed? In this tense and revealing exchange, General Jack Keane argues that the conflict with Iran may be moving out of the language of warning and into the logic of punishment. He says attacks on allies already changed the equation, but an attack on a US warship would change everything. Suddenly, this is no longer just a story about diplomacy or even retaliation. It becomes a story about red lines, regime survival, and how quickly a regional confrontation can become something much bigger than the public was prepared for.
Former Army Vice Chief of Staff, now chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, which is one of the best places to follow what's happening here, and we do it as much as we can. General Keane, thank you for being here. What was he referring to there? You got 10 attacks against U.S. forces, 2 ships taken, but it doesn't meet the threshold to return to end the ceasefire, essentially.
Well, I think what he's saying, the interaction has taken place at the Straits. We're conducting a defensive operation, so we did expect to be attacked, and we're defending against that. But I think there are 2 notable exceptions to that. Number one, they're now attacking our allies in the region. That is not something that's taken place in the Straits. I think that's clearly a violation of the ceasefire agreement. The
UAE attacks you're referring to, excuse me, General. Go ahead.
Attack Qatar briefly, but the UAE, they've come back for a second attack. The second thing is you attack a U.S. warship, nothing is going to be the same after that, because we're not just going to conduct defensive attack against you. We're going to punish you for attacking a warship. We're not going to wait until you hit that warship and kill some of our sailors. We're going to make certain that this thing is off limits. And that is the exception in my book.
All right. So how do you see this? A few days back, we were talking about resuming of talks. We hear Araghchi, the foreign minister, I should say, of Iran, saying that, the Pakistanis have been wonderful and, lots of blah, 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 essentially, at this point. Are there actually negotiations that are still going on that you can tell?
Well, there's likely what has always been going on is some discussion with our negotiating team and some of their emissaries involved in negotiations. And I think they have always operated in the reality that, listen, the objective here, after closing down the Straits and we go to a ceasefire, the objective then was to drag that ceasefire out as much as possible. And how do they do that? By promising that they're going to make some concessions. And now our negotiators hear those words and go back to the president and say, look, this thing looks like it may happen. And you heard him say publicly, look, these guys really want a deal. I think that has always been part of their negotiating strategy. With the Obama administration over the nuclear deal, 18 months they dragged this thing out. They're really good at this. They lie to our faces about what they're willing to make concessions of, and then all of a sudden we're sitting down. We fly all the way out there, 18 hours of sitting across from the guy. Okay, we want to hear the consent. Oh, no, we have to check with somebody else. And somebody else says, no deal. So the president is on to this. And he knows full well. I mean, I called him, he's our stopback measure, because he is not going to accept a bad deal. And that's the reality of it. Nor are they going to give us any deal that would meet his objectives, Martha. And I think that's where we are. The singular objective with the leaders who are running Iran today, it's not the president of Iran, he's sidelined. It's not the foreign minister, he's sidelined. It's not that they're not having voices, but they're not running the place. The guy who's in charge is Ahmed Vahidi, and he is in regular consultation with the Ayatollah's son, who is now the Ayatollah. And that's the reality of it. And he has one singular objective in mind right now, and that is to survive. For he and his leaders to survive this, and at some point they believe they'll recover. That is their objective. And that's why I think even the blockade, which is incredibly good decision on the part of the president, opening up the Straits of Hormuz, another good decision on the part of the president. But at the end of the day, these guys are still thinking about surviving. And as much as the blockade shutting down 100% of their exports, is going to punish them and put them in economic peril, these diabolical, tyrannic leaders are willing to absorb that. But when you look at it through our prism of values and reason, none of that makes any sense. But from their perspective is where you have to look at it. That's why our intelligence guys are so valuable, because they actually put themselves through how are they thinking, as opposed to looking at it through our thinking. I think that's where they are. But right now, we have momentum. We got the blockade going. We're opening up the Straits of Hormuz by force because obviously negotiations couldn't be able to achieve that. I think we're likely going to go into more full-scale combat operations as well as the Iranians continue to up the game here.
As you have said, and I just want to reiterate it, this is not a leadership that cares about their people. So if their people are starving, they don't care. They're all, many of them are in prison right now. Others are hiding in their homes because they're afraid to come out. They're waiting for this regime to be gone, because this regime is the same regime, different faces, but it's the same regime as the son of the former Ayatollah who's giving these orders, as you say, to Vahidi, the head of the IRGC. You always say, in order to win, you have to break the will of your opponent. What would you do right now if you were running this war? How would you break the will of this opponent?
Yeah, I think a number of things. One, go back to full-scale operations. The Straits of Hormuz is a very comprehensive operation that's being conducted, and we don't have all the details of the plan, but I understand the conceptual nature of what's happening. And it involves hundreds of aircraft, a huge layered defense out there. So it's a primary responsibility of our forces. We go back to combat operations, we would only be able to go after selected targets because the primary mission is opening up the straits. However, the Israelis, they are flush at full magazine depth with all the shortages they had, and they're ready to go. And they have a comprehensive target list. They will put huge pressure on the IRGC, the regime itself, sustaining it, energy targets. Obviously, some of the, where these missiles and drones are attacking us in the straits, those are going to be targeted as well. The other thing I think we need to do is certainly Israel has to finish Hezbollah in Lebanon. Right now, they're under the guidance of a ceasefire. Over 50 violations of the ceasefire. And why is that bad for Israel? Because they're in a defensive crouch. They can only attack what is attacking them. They can't attack a command and control headquarters that's planning the attack. That's not according to the rules. So that also, the freedom to finish Hezbollah inside of Lebanon is crucial. The third thing I think we need to do, and hopefully we're doing it, CIA, Mossad together, working, one, to undermine the regime itself covertly, two, assist the Iranian people in gathering a resolve and sense of purpose. As we collapse this regime economically, they're going to be fractured. And I agree, they're going to have difficulty making payroll. There's going to be division there. And the Mossad is really good at approaching these officials and offering them security, financial compensation. And here's what we want from you. We want information. We want you to do X, Y, and Z. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we can do covertly. There are armed groups inside of Iran today, the Kurds, the Azaris, and the Baluchis. I think we should release them and let them start to move.
Didn't President Trump say he didn't want to work with the Kurds?
Yeah.
And they took our weapons that were given to them?
He doesn't, and Erdogan doesn't want us to be involved in this, because every Kurd that he sees out there, even though they're not a threat to Turkey and his power and governance in Turkey, he sees them as a threat. And I think he's misguided in that view.
So do you think President Trump has listened to Erdogan on that?
He's taken counsel of it. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the final decision he makes, but he understands Erdogan's view on it.
Are you suggesting in the list that you just gave us that the Israelis should be the ones to go in and take out the leadership of Iran?
No, we can, in terms of taking leadership out, I think whoever gets the target and has the means to do it should do it. And that's what we both have been doing. What I'm talking about is people on the ground, the Mossad on the ground.
I understand that.
Working inside. They have penetrated the leadership of this country. We've all seen it. And they're very good at it. And the reason why we don't do human intelligence against this target, because we have responsibilities around the world, and the Israelis, they have one target. This is it. And we've always let Democratic or Republican administrations let them be the primary on human intelligence. And as a result of that, their skill sets are enormous. They blend into this population. They look like the population. They're in the culture of the population. They speak without any accent whatsoever in Farsi, and they have achieved enormous results. We should be undermining this regime because we know it's going to start to break apart. And
In the end, what makes this interview so compelling is not simply that Jack Keane sounds forceful. It is that he is describing a conflict that, in his view, is no longer being measured only by what has already been hit, but by what may be hit next. That is the documentary power of this segment. It opens like a strategic analysis, but it slowly turns into a warning about thresholds collapsing. Keane is not speaking as though this is a contained crisis. He is speaking as though the logic of escalation is already in motion, and all that remains is the next trigger. That is why his comments about a U.S. warship matter so much. In his telling, there are still lines on the map of this confrontation, but once one of those lines is crossed, the United States would no longer respond in the same defensive, calibrated way. It would respond to punish. And that single word changes the emotional gravity of the entire conversation. What deepens the tension even further is that Keane does not frame Iran as a normal negotiating actor working toward compromise. He frames it as a regime buying time, stretching talks, and using diplomacy as a delay. That shifts the whole meaning of the interview, because if the viewer accepts that frame, then every pause stops looking like diplomacy and starts looking like preparation. Every round of talk starts feeling less like de-escalation and more like a maneuver. And once that happens, the audience no longer watches the story as if peace is still the default path. They watch it as if war is the shadow growing behind every public statement. That is exactly where high retention comes from in a documentary script. Not from shouting, but from the feeling that the official explanation on the surface may be hiding a much darker timeline underneath it. Then comes the most revealing line of all, that the regime's singular objective is survival. This is where the commentary should slow down and let the audience absorb what that means. Because if survival is the real objective, then ideology, negotiation, retaliation, and propaganda all become tools serving that one end. And once a regime is defined by survival, the crisis stops being just military. It becomes psychological, it becomes political, it becomes a story about how power behaves when it feels cornered. That is the bigger documentary frame hiding inside this Fox interview. Not just whether another strike will happen, but how a government under pressure calculates pain, risk, humiliation, and time. Keane argues that the regime is willing to absorb enormous pressure if it helps preserve itself. And that makes the situation feel even more dangerous, because it suggests that outside pressure alone may not produce quick restraint. It may instead produce harder reactions, more indirect attacks, and more desperate attempts to keep leverage alive. And then the interview expands again. It moves beyond simple retaliation into a much wider vision of conflict. Full-scale combat operations, pressure on Hezbollah, intelligence work, covert operations, internal destabilization, and the idea that the conflict could be fought not just in open strikes, but in networks, proxies, back channels, and internal fractures. That widening of the battlefield is what gives the segment its real strategic weight. This is no longer a conversation about one missile, one ship, or one headline. It becomes a conversation about whether the region is entering a phase where overt war and covert war begin to blur together. That is why the smartest commentary should not treat this clip as only a tough-sounding military interview. It should treat it as a preview of how modern conflict expands, first in rhetoric, then in thresholds, then in geography, then in methods, until the audience realizes the battlefield is much larger than it looked at the beginning. What also makes this story powerful is that it sits at the point where public reassurance starts to break down. The language of diplomacy is still present. The interviews still sound procedural, the questions still sound analytical, but under that surface, the message is chillingly simple. If Iran keeps pushing, the answers may stop being limited. That tension between controlled television discussion and the possibility of uncontrolled real-world escalation is what gives the clip its cinematic force. It feels like the kind of moment people look back on later and say, The warning signs were already there. The lines were already being drawn. The tone had already changed. The only thing the public didn't know yet was how fast events would move once one more step was taken. And that is why the outro should land on unease, not certainty. This interview does not prove that a wider war is inevitable, but it does something almost as powerful. It makes that possibility feel real. It takes viewers from a familiar television segment into a much bigger question about deterrence, miscalculation, and how close the region may be to a response cycle no one can fully control once it begins. So the final feeling should be this. Maybe this is still a warning, and maybe it is already the opening chapter of something larger. But either way, the calm language of policy can no longer hide the volatility underneath it. If the next line is crossed, the story will not just be about what Iran did, it will be about how fast the entire confrontation changed shape. And that is exactly why this moment is worth watching to the end.